on the EU never really surfaces within the national media, which is unfortunate, and I think it's probably one of the reasons why the EU has progressed so far as it has in a very undemocratic nature, is because there's a lack of media attention and political focus on this. So we have basically sleepwalked to the stage we're at, and it's at a critical stage, I think. And I think for the EUD, we are a pan-European body of EU-critical parties and members. We have members in the European Parliament who are EU-critical, and I think it's essential that the EUD, which is Europeans United for Democracy, and just to give you a brief history, we were at one stage called EUD, which is EU Democrats, and we decided to change our name because EU Democrats gave the impression somehow that the EU was democratic. And I suppose our key concern and our main purpose for existence is the fact that the EU is far from democratic. It is probably the most undemocratic structure on the planet. And the unfortunate thing is that not only is it extremely undemocratic, without any democratic legitimacy or any democratic accountability, the way it is presented on the global stage and in the member states is somehow that this is a great democratic and peace project, which is far from what the reality is. Now, our meeting today is basically we decided our friend here, Dele, who has come you're very welcome. He's going to give us, I suppose, to try and look at it from these issues that we are facing within the European Union and see it from another perspective, because I suppose in relation to the lack of democracy and the lack of accountability and the problems that we face, there are similarities between the EU and other parts of the world. And after Dele has spoken, we will have myself and then Lave, and Lave is from Denmark, which is probably the country that has spearheaded the EU critical movement from the beginning, because Denmark, I think, and we owe a huge debt of gratitude to Denmark, because Denmark, on every occasion, even in my own country, when we were having referendums on EU treaties, Denmark, we could always rely on them for support, information, and anything that we needed. And I think that it is a credit to Denmark to see that they have kept the EU critical movement alive within Denmark, because in some countries, the unfortunate thing is that there is no real, it's starting to begin again, but there is no real critical movement, mass movement regarding the EU in a lot of member states. And it's only when the problems arise that for example, in the recent controversies of the last number of years in Greece, the Greek people were completely unaware of how little control they had over their own country and over their own politicians and over their own government, and that the decisions that they thought were being taken in their national parliaments were not being taken in the national parliament, but had been taken very far away in Brussels and Frankfurt. And the implications and the consequences of being in the euro was something that they had never been brought to their attention. And it was only when the crisis occurred that people realised what they were in. But they never sanctioned it, and they never gave it their support. So that's why I think that this meeting today is very important, because there is a huge challenge for organisations and the people that you represent here today to try and push the EU critical movement and the EU critical debate out as far as we can within the media and within the public. And on that note, I'm just going to hand over now to our friend Dele, who's going to speak. I'm just trying to find his the UK situation and the EU-Nigeria parallels. And Dele, he's an author and a solicitor, and I think for most people you will know that there have been huge problems in Nigeria in fact, for many years going back, we've seen the lack of democracy, the huge problems in relation to human rights and legal issues, and there are a lot of parallels there. And I'm handing over now to Dele, if you will very kindly inform us of what's happening and how there are parallels between the EU and Nigeria.
Thank you very much. Madam Chairman, with your permission, I prefer to stand up, because I earn my living standing up and speaking in courts. I don't expect you to pay me today, but at least I'll have the comfort of doing what I normally do. Now, you'll be surprised to learn the lessons that are available to be learned from faraway Nigeria, indeed the whole of Africa, as far as this European Union project is concerned. Can I just check that you can hear me at the back? Can you hear me at the back? Yes, you can hear me. Now, I was at a dinner just last Saturday, a luncheon, and a lady, very informed European lady, English lady, said to me, what do people in your village look like? She said, I've always wondered, because I was talking about my village as usual back in Nigeria. She said, I wonder what they look like. And I said, well, they actually look like me, because but for the accident of my father deciding to come to England to come and advance his studies, I was one of those people that you see in the village. And that question was sincere, but it was also profound. It was profound because it illustrated the heart of the problem, which is the popular media conception of Africa and Africans. You see, if we accept that we only have one human race, then we're led to the conclusion or the realization that democracy is not purely a European ideal. It is a universal aspiration of all people. And what has sort of confused the message is the terminology that's often used. Because if we don't appreciate that there is only one human race and the aspiration towards democracy, i.e. the right to choose and control your representatives, your leaders, is a universal aspiration, then we're led to the conclusion that they can't have anything of relevance to say to us to help us understand what we are going through, and vice versa. We will say nothing here can be of any relevance to what we're experiencing in Africa and in Nigeria. However, once we've got over that hurdle, then we begin to open our minds to the possibility that there are lessons to be shared. Now, where as I said, the confusion has stemmed from is terminology. So the word tribe, for example, leads to issues concerning tribe being described as tribalism. And that connotes pettiness, small-mindedness, and irrational conduct. In contrast, when we talk about nations and we get to nationalism, that suggests issues of statesman-like issues that we're concerned with and suggests rationality. But let me put it in context for you. In this country, the United Kingdom, just a few weeks ago, I can fairly say, there was a referendum in Scotland. The Scottish people were given the opportunity to decide how they wished to be governed. Now, the population of Scotland is around about 5 million. Now, if I told you that the population of my Yoruba people, this is just one of, we don't quite know the right number, maybe 300 ethnic groups in Nigeria, that the population of the Yoruba, which is the second largest, is 60 million people, then you can see how language and terminology where we refer to the Yoruba as a tribe leads to the conclusion that the issues that they are caught up with are just issues of tribalism, pettiness, and rather than issues of nationhood and identity. Now, the fellow who helped me to realize my error of thoughts in thinking that the problem with Africa and the problem with Nigeria was unique and there were no lessons to be learned from the rest of the world and Europe in particular, was a fellow who was actually who could fairly claimed to be the father of both, at least one of the fathers, of both the Nigeria structure, the Nigerian Federation, and the European Union. It was a letter that he wrote to the Times newspaper back in, I think it was the early 90s, that made me to realize that, it is not a unique problem, this is just a human problem. And there are lessons to be learned and there are lessons to be shared. I will share with you the letter that he wrote to the Times. The fellow's name is Sir Peter Smithers. He was the parliamentary private secretary to the Minister of State and the Secretary of State in the Colonial Office from 1952 to 59. This is in the run-up to Nigeria's independence. Of more significance to yourselves, he was also the Secretary General to the Council of Europe from 1964 to 1969. And here's a letter that he wrote to the Times. It was published on the 15th of July 1998. It goes as follows. Sir, during the negotiations for the independence of Nigeria, the view of the Secretary of State at that time, with which I agreed, was that in Nigeria we should attempt to put together a large and powerful state with ample material resources which would play a leading part in the affairs of the continent and of the world. This was attractive, but it involved forcing several different ethnic and cultural groups into a single political structure. The negotiations were complex and very difficult, the chief problem, as I remember, relating to the control of the police and the military. In a retrospect of 40 years, it is clear that this was a grave mistake which has cost many lives and will probably continue to do so. It would have been better to establish several smaller states in a free trade area. In exculpation, it must be said that we did not then have the examples of the collapse of Yugoslavia and of the Soviet Union before our eyes. It should now be clear for all but the willfully blind to see that it is extremely dangerous to force diverse racial and social entities into a single rigid structure, such as that which is being built upon the foundation of the Maastricht Treaty. Recent history suggests that it will be best to complete the development of the common market and to call a halt to political integration in Europe. Now that letter really opened my eyes and my mind to realize that these problems of governance and the scale of governance are universal. That Nigeria's problem was not unique. Now, both federal structures were born in the aftermath of the Second World War, where the objective was to secure the peace once and for all. That was the laudable objective. And it was born out of the Atlantic Charter that was published on the 14th of August 1941. And Article 3 of that charter recognized the right that the objective that they respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and that they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Now you might then wonder, how did it all go wrong? How did we get to where we are? How it went wrong in my analysis is that the power mongers who benefit from mega structures rather than people-centered political arrangements, they took over the project. And so initially, the actual plan for Europe was to bind all the vanquished states in a new United States of Europe. I refer as authority for that to a passage in the biography of Sir Anthony Eden, former Prime Minister of this country. And he said this: the federal movement in Europe has a long history. In 1946, Mr. Winston Churchill revived its prospects in a speech in Zurich, when he declared that we must build a kind of United States of Europe. In 1949, a conference of European statesmen was held at The Hague, and the Council of Europe was founded. Now, in its original design, the European Union was actually supposed to be a vehicle for British control of Europe, and not European control of Britain. For it was never intended at the outset that Britain should actually be a member. Now, authority for this you'll find in Harold Macmillan's autobiography, where he said, Federation of Europe means Germanization of Europe. Confederation, if we play our cards properly, should be British leadership of Europe. Now, that was the origin of the design. But then how did it come to pass that Britain became a member of the project and a victim of the arrangements that it was setting up to use to control the rest of Europe? This was due to a fallout with the United States of America after the Americans perceived that they had been let down on the Vietnam crisis, where they expected Britain to stand shoulder to shoulder, side by side with them in the invasion of Vietnam. And when that did not happen, the American administration decided to embark on a slogan of Europe for the Europeans. Again, it was at that stage it was supposed to be a balanced arrangement. But all these wonderful designs all end up in the same place, and it's for the simple reason that those whose highest ideal is money, they take over the agenda. You see, because for them, the larger the markets, and you recorded in my original quotation from Sir Peter Smithers in relation to Nigeria and also in relation to Europe, it was the idea of a large market. And those whose highest priority is commerce, they see us not as Nigerians and Danes and Swedes and Britons. They see us as economic units, and the greater the amalgamation of units that they can achieve, then the economies of scale flow from that. And one of the biggest danger of any mega states, such as the European Union, is this: that our votes that we think we have are absolutely meaningless, because here's the primary lesson from those who come from villages like myself. You see, if you have an election in a village, you don't really need a campaign budget. Everybody knows everybody, not just of this generation, but of generations past. So he cannot represent us because his father was a thief. It's a generational knowledge. Whereas in a large state, our means of knowing one another, our representatives, is simply by means of what we read and what we hear. What we read in the newspapers of David Cameron, we have no personal knowledge of him. What we see on TV or hear on TV about Tony Blair, we have no personal knowledge of him, as distinct from a small political setting where personal knowledge is what you use to determine and assess whether that person should represent you or not. And once the multiplier effect takes hold within a so-called democratic setting, then the real ballot sheet is the euros in your pockets. That is the real ballot sheet. If you can fill the piece of paper, is meaningless. It is those that control the campaign funds that will then determine who your representatives are, simply by virtue of their purchasing power. Now, I say that because that's what happens in my part of the world, Nigeria, where the elections, the outcomes are predictable from the outset. And you will never get conviction politicians coming through. You never will. It will always be the compromise politicians, the ones who are ready to compromise the values, compromise the ideals. Those are the ones who are more electable, as against the ones who really speak from the heart and to the hearts of the people. Well, those are my comments by way of introduction. I hope that I've sort of prepared the ground for what's to come. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you, Dele, for and it was really interesting, the kind of parallels between Nigeria and the EU, and those letters you've quoted are very interesting. I think a lot of us will be looking for details from you later on as regards the sources. Is it myself or yourself next?
It can be me
if you want to go. Yeah, Lave Broch from the People's Movement in Denmark is going to speak now about alternatives to the EU.
Yes, thanks a lot, and I'm so happy to be here and also see so many people from different countries in Europe. And it was great to hear Dele's speech here before. I think one of the big problems in Europe is actually that the democracy is lacking. Only 2 countries have had separate referendums about the euro, and that's Denmark and Sweden. We voted no. All the countries which joined the euro joined without separate referendums about the euro. And I think there is, what Dele is saying, a problem. If you try to force people together, not even asking them what they want, then we have a problem in the whole foundation of the EU. I come from the People's Movement in Denmark. We have existed 42 years. We have been represented in the EU Parliament since the first direct election, 1979. We have around 100 local branches in Denmark. We are a cross-political movement. So this means that we represent people on the left side, in the middle where I'm social liberal, and then we have people on the right side. But we work on a non-racist platform. So our goal is tolerance and respect between people, and also the right of self-determination for all people on this planet. We got 8.1% of the votes in the last EU Parliament election, and I'm substitute member to the Parliament. It was a girl who is 28-year-old, Rina Ronja Kari, who was elected. So she is now sitting in the Parliament and voting hundreds of times every session. We do not believe that being in the Parliament will actually reform the EU, but we think it's really important that we are there, because we are following what's going on. We are trying to do what we can to make the problem smaller. So when we see that, for instance, EU is undermining environment, or EU is making a trade agreement with a country, for instance in Africa, where a government is taking the money and the local fishermen are losing the possibility to fish, then we are stepping in and trying to highlight the problems. So we do as good as we can, but 1 member out of 751 is not a lot. Luckily, we have a cooperation, and we are then in EUD, where we also cooperate, and we are in team, where we also have cooperation. Then we have a Nordic cooperation, which is quite close with our Nordic cross-political movements. I was going to speak about alternatives to the EU, and I want to ask you one thing. Have you heard about TINA? there is no alternative. There is no alternative. That's Tina. And she is a dangerous woman because they are actually using Tina against us who are critical against the EU. First of all, they say that our countries are too small. We probably heard that, everyone. I know that even people in Britain sometimes hear that Britain is too small to be outside the EU. And coming from Denmark, where we are just 5.5 million people, it's quite interesting to hear that 60 million people can be too small. Also knowing that Iceland, which is 300,000 people, actually are outside the EU. So I think Tina is used against us. And we also hear that it's a disaster to stand outside. We cannot trade. It's not possible to cooperate. No one will invest in our countries. And they even say, don't you want to be part of Europe? So the words they're using is not, do you want to be part of European Union? But they even with a framework trying to tell us that EU is Europe. So if Denmark should leave, we're not only leaving EU, we are leaving Europe. And who are against Europe? Especially in Britain, I often hear people talking about Europe as the EU. But that is to win the debate. Because if you can actually put the question so the answer is given from the beginning, you have already won a big part of the debate. If you ask people, would you vote yes to United Kingdom leaving Europe? You know, would you vote yes to leave the world? That could also have been the question. Of course you cannot leave Europe. Britain is part of Europe. Denmark is part of Europe. But we are not necessarily part of the EU. That's up to us as a political choice. And I must say, Tina is a challenge, but we can see living alternatives. Greenland, as a part of the Danish kingdom, actually joined Denmark into the EU. But in 1982, there was a referendum in Greenland, and a majority of the population voted no to continue to be part of the EU. After negotiations, where the Danish government had to travel around to all capitals in the EU, it was negotiated a withdrawal so that Greenland could leave the European Union, and that happened in 1985. And Greenland, they got fishery agreements, they got trade agreements. They did not become a hole in the ground. It's not that people stopped invest there, and they're still part of the Danish kingdom as well. So they were not being pushed away or forgotten. Iceland, as I mentioned before, they went through one of the worst economic crises. In Britain, it's quite well known with iSafe scandal and all this. Iceland, do you know how high is the unemployment in Iceland? Does anyone know here? Yes. It's between 4 and 5%. How much is it in Greece or Spain? 27%. And the youth unemployment is like 60%. 75, yeah. So Greece was really lucky to have the help from the EU, because they turned out to get 27% unemployment after a financial crisis. Iceland, which is outside, has also not only lower unemployment, but according to a survey from the Eurostat, which came out a week ago, Iceland is, among all the EU countries, Norway and Switzerland, the country with the lowest risk of poverty and social exclusion. Iceland went from a financial crisis to have a lower unemployment than most EU countries, to be the country with the lowest degree of poverty and social exclusion, while they are not member of the EU. They didn't need the helping hand. The helping hand which Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland got was actually not giving the people the development that they would expect. And in Iceland, people could see the development. So the last few years, all the opinion polls in Iceland has shown that the majority of Icelanders would vote no to membership of the European Union. And when they got the new government, one of the first things they did was to close down the committee which was going to change Icelandic law so they would be compatible with the European Union. And the Icelandic government has stopped the negotiations with the European Union. It is not realistic that Iceland will join. Norway, they have voted twice about the European Union. They voted in 1972 and they voted in 1994, 20 years ago. They voted no both times. Switzerland has never ever voted about European Union membership. They are not interested in joining. The UK will probably have a referendum in 2017. Hopefully, they will have a referendum. Actually, most of the countries on this planet are outside the European Union. So of course it's possible to trade and to cooperate without being members of the European Union. For us in the Danish People's Movement, there are several goals when we talk about withdrawal from the European Union. First of all, we want Denmark to have influence globally. We want Denmark to have a cooperation where we can study, travel, trade, work, live across borders. We want Denmark to work for a living democracy, high environmental standards, the Nordic welfare state, and global solidarity. We actually believe it's possible to create such an alternative. First of all, we can see that the EFTA countries can already cooperate on several areas. The EFTA countries, you have two roads you can choose. You can choose the road Switzerland has chosen, which is bilateral agreements, or you can choose the road Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein chose, which is the EEA agreement. In the Danish People's Movement, we think the Swiss solution is the best of those two roads. However, we can see that all of those countries has a better position than Denmark. They can both trade and cooperate with the EU, and they have more democracy on those areas where the EU does not have influence. The Swiss solution means that the EU court does not make decisions. In the EEA agreement, when Norway has passed a law, there is the EFTA court, but that is actually, you can say, the prolonged arm from the EU. So for Norway, they actually, when they have said no to a directive, it's not part of the EEA agreement, but if they say yes, they give EU power over this area for eternity, as long as they are members of the EEA. But for us in the Danish People's Movement, it's not only about trade and cooperation. For us, it's also about human rights, development, and many other things, peace, for instance. We have many times looked at the Norwegian way to negotiate peace. Norway has not joined the EU terror lists. I don't know if you know that in the European Union, they have a terror list where they put, in almost every conflict, they put one of the sides on the terror list and the other side they think is a good guy. For instance, in Palestine-Israel conflict, they have Hamas on a terror list, but not Israel. They export weapons to Israel. They have the best trade agreements with Israel, but the other side is terrorists. In Colombia, they put FARC on the terror list. It's a group there working for a different Colombia, and then you have the government. But Norway, they actually, in those conflicts and many other conflicts, they've been going in and said, no, we will not put FARC on a terror list. We will not put Colombian government on a terror list. We can see both parts are doing something bad. We will actually try to bring them together so that they can negotiate. And Norway did that in Colombia, and there actually came out a result. Lucky, Colombia is not a peaceful place yet, but the Norwegian actually managed to get the parts together, sit down at the table, and even talk about how you can make a new agricultural reform where small farmers will actually get land from the big farmers and things like that. So I think that is a good thing, actually, that Nordic countries can work for peace negotiations instead of pointing out who are terrorists and who are friends. We see a role for Denmark inside the United Nations. We want a stronger United Nations, of course a more reformed United Nations. We think that Council of Europe is a great place to talk human rights, and it's important that we have countries like Russia and Turkey inside Council of Europe Council of Europe is sometimes misunderstood because some people think that it's the EU Council or something like that. Council of Europe, I think most of you know, that's an organization where around 47, 48 countries are members. Only Belarus in Europe is not a member state. And if your human rights are violated, then you can, in your own nation, you can actually go to the Council of Europe's court in Strasbourg, the European Human Rights Court, and they will take your case if you have used all the possibilities nationally. We think that is a good thing. Also the OSCE, where we have an organization for security and cooperation in Europe, that we try actually with peaceful means to prevent conflicts and observe what's going on in different places, and also when there are election campaigns. So we see there is a lot of different frameworks for cooperation. So being outside the EU doesn't mean that you are not cooperating or not trading or not working for good goals anymore. In the People's Movement, we also believe that it would be good if we had a stronger Nordic cooperation. We think that the Nordic countries several times have worked for good goals, not only to strengthen our life in the Nordic countries, but also to fight for a better world. For instance, the Nordic countries were pioneers in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. When Nelson Mandela went on his last trip as president, he did not go to Berlin or to Paris or to Washington, D.C. He went to the Nordic capitals because the Nordic countries were his friends before he became president, before the other Western countries, before the big powers in Europe or the Western world were against apartheid. The Nordic countries were actually talking strongly against it. And I think that role for the Nordic countries can be possible again, where we are actually standing for development, where we're standing for human rights, for peace, on a totally different way than you see it when the Western countries normally say they work for peace. We have made opinion polls in the Nordic countries. In Denmark, it was the think tank New Agenda. And it was a question if you should choose a Nordic League, which has trade and cooperation agreements with the EU instead of EU membership. And in Denmark, 47% of the population would choose the Nordic Alliance or League instead of EU membership, and 28% would choose the EU, if that was the choices. The EUD also made the opinion polls in Finland and Sweden together with partners, and the results were similar. In Finland, 50% would choose a Nordic alliance, only 31% would choose the EU if it was a Nordic alliance, which was the choice. In Sweden, it was 49% for the Nordic alliance and 28% for the EU. So we can actually see if we put an alternative which is positive as the question, we get even a bigger outcome than if we only ask, would you like to be members of the EU or not? I will end now. I think I've been around. I also would just here at the end say that the ever-increasing centralization of power, that EU is undermining the democracy, and that we at the same time see policies which is bad for the environment, which is damaging the social welfare, and that we see EU policies which is hurting the development in other countries, even undermining peace, is a reason for us to look about alternatives. So the whole development in the EU is actually the reason. We are not saying no to the EU because we are against Europe. We are saying no to the EU because we want something better. We want a better cooperation, a living democracy, a good environment. We want a good welfare, and we want global solidarity. Thanks.
Thank you, Lave, and I better stand since everyone else has done so. First of all, I just want to comment on something that Dele mentioned, because he was talking about the lack of democracy in Nigeria in relation to people having access to their politicians, and the further removed you are from the power-making centre, the less accountable your politicians will be. I mean, most Europhiles would look aghast if I said, Nigeria is actually much more democratic than the EU, because at least they elect their politicians, whether they have who make the decisions. Within the EU, we do not elect those who make decisions on our behalf. The key decision makers within the EU are the Council of Ministers and the Commission. The Commission are appointed under the table by wheeling and dealing by governments who decide who they will send to be the Commissioner. The people have no say whatsoever in who is put into that body, which is the only body within the EU that can initiate legislation, is the Commission. The people have absolutely no say on who those people are. The Council of Ministers is not accountable in the same way as ministers would be at a national level, because you can't hold a Council of Ministers accountable, because they're not accountable to their members at home, as in a national government, where if the ministers take a decision in the national parliament, an election comes around again, you can actually vote for another party and not the party that minister belonged to. Whereas within the EU, you can't do that, because the Council of Ministers, first of all, you don't even know what your own minister's position is, because there is this kind of decision-making structure which is extremely undemocratic, and I'll go into that in a few minutes as well in relation to recent changes in the Council of Ministers and the decision-making process. The only body that's directly elected by the peoples in the member states of Europe is the Parliament. And the Parliament, while it will be presented by Europhiles as having a real say, it's a real democracy because the European Parliament has a role in deciding legislation and laws. It's what's called this co-legislative process, where the Parliament, in conjunction with, through the co-decision procedure, agrees with Council in relation to Commission proposals. But because the Parliament has to come to some sort of agreement and consensus, you can't hold the parliamentarians to account for the laws that are decided at a European level. European parliamentarians, the European Parliament has no right to initiate legislation. The only thing it can actually do is refuse to agree to proposed legislation. And it doesn't really do that. But the problem is you can't hold the MEPs to account back in the national member states, because they can argue justifiably, look, we had to come to some agreement because we're only X number within a huge structure. And because there is no sort of accountability chain there, it's impossible to hold them to account. So there is no exaggeration in saying that Nigeria is much more democratic than the EU in relation to how laws are made and how laws are decided. In relation to the member states that are in the EU at the moment, as Lave has pointed out in relation to some things like, for example, on the euro, very few citizens within the member states of the European Union have had any say on the progress that is made. Some member states have never had a referendum on joining the EU. They're just automatically a part of it. Other member states who did decide to join, sometimes they've been asked a few times, like the Norwegians, and they've refused. Other countries, you'd have to look at how democratic the referendum process was in the member states, particularly the more vulnerable member states like the former Eastern European countries. For example, Ireland was held up as some sort of wonderful economic success to many of those countries at a time when Ireland's economy was booming, and saying, look, to the former Eastern European countries, you can be like this, you can be like Ireland, because at that stage Ireland was booming. There was no, when the whole thing went belly up in Ireland, there was nobody turning around and saying, oh yeah, well, we take responsibility for that in Europe. No, it was all right to use Ireland when it was beneficial for the EU to push to get member states to join. Likewise with the euro. Many of the new member states, like for example the recent members like Estonia and Latvia, the peoples in those countries wanted a referendum to join the EU, but they were refused by their governments the right to have a referendum, because the governments did not want them to have a referendum, because the EU said do not let them vote, because they will not vote to join a currency that's nobody knows what the future holds for it. Like anyone in their right mind would not decide to join the EU. And this is, somebody said this last night in a conversation, saying, well, if the EU is so bad and the euro is so bad, why are people lining up to join? But they're not. It's their governments have pushed them in to join, so that it can be held up as an example to the international financial markets. Look, the euro isn't as bad as we think, because Here's Estonia's joined, here's Latvia's joined. But opinion polls, as the EUD pointed, we did research before they joined, showed that the people in those countries would have voted against, they would have rejected membership of the Eurozone. As Lave said, many countries had no say. In fact, the Euro project was presented in the Maastricht Treaty. It was part of the Maastricht Treaty. I think only 3 countries had a referendum on that. That was Denmark, Ireland and France. In Ireland, we voted to accept it. In Denmark, they rejected it, but they were asked to vote again. And in France, the vote was very, very tight. It was just over 50%, something voted in favour. But the Maastricht Treaty was not actually presented as a treaty that brought forward. The euro and the consequences of the euro were never even debated. In fact, in Ireland, as is usual in Ireland, every referendum is centred around abortion. The Maastricht Treaty, the main topic of conversation and the main topic within the referendum campaign in Ireland was on abortion, believe it or not, in the Maastricht Treaty, even though one of the biggest changes ever to take place within our country was to sign up to this euro. That was one of the most important aspects of the Maastricht Treaty, but it wasn't what was mentioned because all the focus was on this protocol that was attached to Ireland's abortion laws, which was totally irrelevant. The key thing was, what did the Maastricht Treaty present? And I was a member of the European Parliament at the time when we did actually join the euro, and people were phoning up the office saying, well, why are we not having a referendum on this? And I said, we've already had the referendum when we voted on the Maastricht Treaty. Oh, no, that was about abortion. I said, no, it wasn't. Now, and that's the problem. In Greece, as we could see in recent years, when everything started to go terribly wrong, the Greek people were wondering, how did all this come about? The Greeks had never a say on joining the euro. The Italians never voted on joining the euro. The Portuguese, all these various different countries never agreed on joining the euro. They never voted on it. Their governments railroaded them in without their consent. So that is far from being democratic. And this is one of the major problems. And the reason for all of this is because the EU does not want the people to have a say, because if the people have a say and if they seriously consider what the options are, they may not go with it. And in fact, as we know, in recent referendums, people are starting more and more to become more and more critical of where the EU is going. And I found one of the things in Ireland when we joined the euro, there was no public debate, as I said, and I was coming over here yesterday and I lifted the paper and I just was quite shocked to see this, but Ireland will not remain silent on UK vote on EU. So Ireland has now decided that it's going to get involved in it. If the UK have a vote on EU membership, they're going to get involved, and their arguments are that Ireland will argue strongly and publicly for Britain to stay in the European Union if a referendum is held on the issue. And the reason they say is because the Irish government is obliged by its closest ever economic and political links between the two islands to make its views heard respectfully and very clearly. And it says that Irish people, north and south, have many serious issues at stake were Britain to end its membership of the European Union. These issues are fundamental and we cannot remain silent on these matters. It goes on about that, but why I'm just reading out those couple of quotes is, when we joined the euro, as you know, Ireland has a border between the north and south. There are two key issues here. One was, what impact was this going to have on the economies north and south of the border? It was never considered. The second issue was Ireland's trade with the UK. And as I mentioned here, about one of the key things is the trade with the UK. That's why the Irish government is saying they can't stay silent when the British have a referendum on EU membership, because of the trade with Britain. But they never gave it a second thought when we joined the euro. They never decided, well, look, Britain is not joining at the moment. Is this a good idea or not? Instead, they went ahead, being the good little Europeans that they're supposed to be, and decided to sign us up. And despite the kind of picture that's been painted all over Europe and indeed around the world, that Ireland's economic crisis is basically down to the mismanagement by our own completely incompetent politicians, while yes, they're incompetent and corrupt and all the rest, it is not. One of the key things, and if you read Bernard Connolly's book and other very good analysis of it, one of the key things was being part of the euro was fundamental to that, and the same in Greece, where a huge amount of surplus money was sent to Greece, to Ireland, to Spain and other countries, and that when the crisis happened, and this has come up recently, huge pressure was put on the Irish not to let the banks fall because, of course, German banks and others had lent huge amounts of money to Ireland and other peripheral countries. And we were warned about this. So at the end of the day, we in Ireland and other peripheral countries, the ordinary people, the taxpayers, will have to foot the bill to ensure that the Euro project survives. Doesn't matter how much suffering and hardship ordinary people will have to suffer, the Euro project takes priority. And that has been demonstrated very clearly by the Euro elite over the last number of years. The other thing I just wanted to mention was in relation to the changes that have taken place. As you know, most member states have refused to hold referendums on changes to EU treaties. Some countries like Ireland and Denmark have held them. On the EU constitution, which was then renamed the Lisbon Treaty, 2 of the founding members of the EU, France and the Netherlands, voted to reject the EU constitution. And instead of actually saying, right, we've had 2 countries rejecting this, we can't go ahead with it, because you can't. Unless all member states agree, the treaty can't go ahead. Instead of that, they took the thing back, repackaged it, called it something else, and put it out again. And this time, they denied the French and the Dutch the right to vote on it. And the only country, because of our constitution, the constitutional, written constitution in Ireland, the Irish people had to vote on it. There was no way, if the EU governments could have avoided Ireland having a vote on the Lisbon Treaty, they would have ensured that they didn't, but they couldn't. So Ireland had a vote on what had been rejected by the French and the Dutch, but had been repackaged and presented to the Irish. The Irish had a vote on it and they said no. What happened then? We were told, like we were with the Nice Treaty some years earlier when we voted no, we had to vote again. We got the answer wrong. We were confused. We didn't know what we were voting on. You better vote again, you got it wrong. The same this time. With the Lisbon Treaty, we were told we had to vote again because, of course, we were misguided. We didn't understand. So the Lisbon Treaty was put to the people again. And so when you consider that we had 2 referendums in Ireland on the Lisbon Treaty, you would imagine that the Irish people and the politicians would be very well informed on what the Lisbon Treaty entailed. One of the most significant changes in the Lisbon Treaty was how, and I come back now to what we're talking about, the Council of Ministers, which is the kind of most powerful institution in the EU, how decisions are taken within that institution. And for the first time ever since the EU was set up, population is how they would divide up how the member states, what proportion of votes each member state would get. Up until the Lisbon Treaty was ratified, member states, it didn't go in population. Ireland had 2%, Germany had 8%, despite the fact that it had a bigger population. The Lisbon Treaty introduced, and it's just come in this month, even though the Lisbon Treaty has been ratified, the agreement was that it would come in on the 1st of November. And on the 1st of November, the voting system within the Council of Ministers is now based on population size. So Ireland's vote drops from 2% to under 1%, 0.9%. All the small countries drop. Germany doubles its vote from 8 to 16%. And Germany and France between them have, I think it's 1/3 of the EU population. Therefore, they have a huge, and in relation to the Eurozone area, they have half the population. So they have, within this new procedure, they have what they can do is a blocking minority. If they can get 2 other states to come with them, they can block things they don't want. Whereas if small countries try to block anything, it's impossible with 0.9% of the vote. You haven't got a hope. The only thing you can hope is that, well, whatever you want will be in line with what Germany and France want. That's the only way you're going to get what you want. Otherwise, you can just forget about it. This was one of the most fundamental changes to how laws are made in Europe, and it was introduced with the Lisbon Treaty. 2 referendums were held in Ireland. The Irish people, there was an opinion poll carried out by the EUD there last year, and 69% of Irish people were unaware of this change. 69% of people were unaware of the fact that and we tried during that campaign to highlight this, 69% of people were unaware of the fact that this huge change to how EU laws are made. In other member states throughout the EU, in fact in Germany and other countries, they still are unaware of this. And in fact, in recent conversations we've had with some members in other member states, they don't know about it. They didn't know, they weren't informed. So there is a huge avoidance of actually addressing or highlighting what the issues are. But having said that, in relation to the other member states, not one other member state had the right to vote on the Lisbon Treaty. And the governments went behind their backs and conspired against their own citizens to ensure that they would not have a vote. And there is no doubt or no denying that fact. So when we talk about democracy, how can we have a democracy where our own political leaders have decided to give away any possibility for us to have a say on who makes decisions on our behalf? And when Dele was talking about how in Nigeria, when you know the people you're electing, you have a lot more control over them, you know who they are, and the more centralised and bigger the system gets, the less chance you have of knowing who those people are. But this is even worse than that, in that the people who make the laws aren't even elected by us. It's not the European Parliament that make the laws, it's the Commission and the Council. And we don't elect either of them. So, this is a major issue for those who are involved in the EU critical movement, because it's been presented somehow that those who are critical of the EU are somehow living in the past, that they're looking backwards, that they're not progressive, that they're racist, that they're whatever else you may think, whatever negative things they can attach to it. But in actual fact, and that's why we said that we're about Europeans united for democracy, that the big lie here is that there is no democratic legitimacy to the EU project. And despite the fact that it's held up all over the world as some great democratic project, it is not that. It is far from it. And when Dele was mentioning as well about the idea of tribes and nations, one of the arguments, again, and it comes up with the British, that the British are somehow nationalistic because they want to have a referendum on the EU, and this idea of the EU will get rid of nationalism. But we have within the European Union, and I've experienced this, I spent 10 years in the European Parliament, and I'm telling you, if you're critical of the EU, it's almost like, treasonous. The EU has its own national anthem, it has its own flags, it has its own logo, it has everything you can think of that's attached to a kind of a nation. And if you try to speak out against it, it's like you're guilty of treason. So you have this, you're going from a nationalism to a pseudo-nationalism. So how is that better? And how can we actually tackle it? Because we have a system now where those that criticise the EU are somehow not patriotic in some way to this nation that doesn't actually exist. And I think that it's extremely important that people realise that. And the media, and in particular, don't highlight this. I watched the debates in the UK, and the only sort of critical analysis you get is from the UKIP party. And again, it comes down to they're trying to trivialise it, in that someone said to me, well, Nigel Farage is very rude and obnoxious the way he speaks to people like Van Rompuy and that, about, well, who are you? And it may sound rude, right? But in actual fact, the point that's been made here, I think, my interpretation, like I'm not a UKIP supporter or anything like that, my interpretation is that what he's really saying is, well, who elected you? Who elected you? Where did you come from? These people were not elected by the ordinary people, yet they're speaking on behalf of all the people of Europe, somehow as if they've been given a mandate by the people of Europe, but they have not been given a mandate. And as has been said, democracy is about choosing the people you want to make decisions on your behalf. And that does not exist within the European Union. And that's why I think it's very important that we look at other alternatives, and that we try and highlight to people that being critical of the EU and criticising the type of EU that exists and that the EU is undemocratic is actually forward thinking. It's about looking for a better future, and it's about looking for true democracy, true accountability, and the possibility that we can actually control to a certain extent decisions that are being made on our behalf. And I think I will just leave it at that. Just if there was one other thing I had to mention, but I've probably forgotten it now. No. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I can't remember what the last point was. Thank you. So now I think we'll open it up to the floor. So if anyone would like to ask some questions, will we take them two at a time or something? Yeah. 2 or 3 at a time. So okay, Richard and John. Richard. Yeah, you better stand up and say your name.
Yes, I'm Richard from the EUD, and my question is to hear about this Nigerian perspective. I heard there was an eastern region that wanted to secede from Nigeria. Is this linked to this? Can you put it into relation? The EU has put any pressure on the central government, like pressure to have modernization with
nations within the Nigerian construct have tried to escape, to go back to what they were before Nigeria was constructed in 1914. The one that most people heard about was the Biafra War, which cost, it is estimated, about 3 million lives. And it was a proxy war to ensure that the structure remained, because the architects of the structure were determined that it should be preserved. Once you're in, they never let you go.
It's like the US.
They would never let you go. Whatever it takes. They will do it. It's financial. They'll use financial inducements to persuade the more vulnerable people to vote against leaving, assuming they give you the chance to vote on the issue. And if all else fails, then wars, military force will be used to keep you in, because the fear, because it is an artificial construct, it is anti-democratic, and I speak with both reference to the European Union and the Nigeria Federation. It is anti-democratic, it is anti-people, so therefore it's a bit like a prison, and you can't afford for the inmates to escape, because if one gets out, then it becomes more and more difficult to keep the rest in. And so the first one that tries to get out, you've got to make sure that you send a message to all others that don't you even think of it. And now what's going on in Nigeria, in the newspapers you'll hear about a group called Boko Haram. They are operating in the northeast of Nigeria. Again, the underlying issue is that the ethnic group in that area was, again, shoehorned into the federation. And once the colonial arrangements that kept the order was taken away, the aspiration for people to retrace and retrieve their true identity takes hold. And the real underlying issue in that area is a desire for the Kanuri people, some of who are to be found in Chad, some of who are to be found in Cameroon, to leave Nigeria. That is the underlying issue. We deal with the symptoms of the problem, but the underlying issue is, again, that artificial structure, construct, people seek to leave.
John?
I don't know whether this is the right point to come in. I want to make a contribution to discussion rather than a direct question. Is that okay? It's longer than a question. Okay. Well, I'm John Boyd from the centre-left campaign against Eurofederalism, which is aimed at the London trade union movement in Britain. So I'd like to say, as a true Londoner, welcome to London and to this Victorian pile, which was built during the height of the British Empire during the Victorian era. I've never been in this before, but you can see imperialism all around you, or all the wood imported from the colonies and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting building which I've never been. I've walked past it many times. So welcome to London. On the question of a referendum in Britain, there are those of us who are against holding a referendum because we want a government which is going to take us out of the EU. Because, as de Gaulle said, a government doesn't hold a referendum that it's going to lose. That is a good quote. Now, organisations here are for and against it, but that's to be debated and so on. Now, in Britain at the moment, we have 1 million young unemployed. We're subject to the austerity policies which come and stem from Brussels. We're suffering as much as the Eurozone countries as anything. There are 10 million people in London. There is a huge housing crisis, and it's getting worse and worse. So don't think that Britain is a nice place to come to. It's not. And I could tell stories from now till 10 o'clock of families which are suffering. Anyway, I want to go back to this pile, this Victorian pile, to imperialism, because imperialism started in 1865 when they had the scramble for Africa, divided up the Africa, put straight lines on maps and said, well, you could have that bit, I'll have that bit, and that bit, and so on. So that's where the modern imperialism comes from and is still in place today. The EU has all the Lome and Cotonou trade agreements with all these countries, including the Caribbean and Pacific countries, which keep these countries in poverty. The example in the African countries, including your own country, is because they haven't enough money to run a proper health service.